Okay, although there are many ways I could approach the debunking or the telling of the reality of Noah's Ark, one of the major tales that are known out of the Bible, I thought I would assist myself and show a variation of reality through the Oriental Institute and Irving Finkle. Now, I tried to do this once before and it got flagged, so I'm going to leave it picture in a picture like they do for all of the critiques and so on. And I'm doing this as a review or a critique of this situation, and I will put the original down in the comments so you can look through it and see it separately. He's quite a humorous man, and there's some neat things shown throughout this. So let's continue, and we'll see if we can get this to pass through this time.
I'm going to talk to you about this topic, the Ark before Noah, which has been a big adventure, which has converted my life from the dull, tedious, dusty and unexciting life of a normal curator into just the opposite, with heart-endangering consequences. So one of the things that happens if you are a curator in the British Museum is, because the public have the mistaken idea that we are experts, is to identify things which people bring in. And they always make a lot of fuss about how interested they are when you tell them it's Middle Bronze Age or Late Iron Age or something of this sort of technical side, because what they really want to know is how much they're worth. And we are...
And that's common, you know, just like going to an antique roadshow or something and be like, well, this has been passed down from my great-grandfather who had a tchotchke cabinet that he had gotten, and he got this from Egypt and then this tablet here and some other tchotchkes. And of course he thought the Chinese things that he showed, because Chinese art was very popular at the time, and this little clay lump probably didn't mean anything, but quite the opposite. Let's let him go on.
Forbidden by the trustees from ever referring to this matter, so we are experienced in dealing with all sorts of drama. And it happened to me once when I was on duty that a person called Douglas Simmons came in about 1985 with a bag full of antiquities, small antiquities, which he poured onto the desk, and I was the duty officer. And it contained some coins, a couple of lamps, a bit of Chinese stuff, a couple of shabtis, and a cuneiform tablet. Well, it might not surprise you to know that I picked up the cuneiform tablet first.
Shabtis are the little dolls that are buried with the Egyptians to be their helper in the afterlife. They first used to kill some of the people and to go with them to the afterlife, like the Sumerians did. And this was taking as being probably not a good idea, because after doing that a couple of times, you end up with some people that don't know what the hell they're doing anymore. So that was changed a little bit, but you can tell he gravitated toward the cuneiform tablet first. Let's continue.
And I picked it up, and at first sight I assumed it was going to be an old Babylonian letter. I'm sure you would have the same conclusion in terms of size, shape, dimension, grammatical form, semantic parallels, and so forth. But I lifted it up and started to read it. And this is what came out. I'm not going to read the whole of this book out. I should tell you, if you want to read it yourself, it is easily arranged. It's very easily arranged afterwards.
He always adds some humor into the situation, sometimes kind of like a mean school marm, where I'll tell you that that no one's allowed to go to sleep during the thing here, and that there will be a test afterwards, and so on, trying to break the ice with people, keep it all going and everything. But he is a cherished part of British history, and I think maybe not as much, but close to, of people of caliber of David Attenborough and so on, for being tell you certain things. But let's continue. This is what it says.
Wall, read wall, atra hasis, pay heed to my advice that you may live forever. Destroy your house, build a boat, spurn property, and save life. Well, not many letters begin that way, and in point point of fact, I was able to read it at sight because I had a very demanding teacher who used to hit people and thrash them with barbed wire until they learnt their signs. And so, recognizing the beginning of the flood story in the Babylonian epic was a doddle for someone who graduated from that classroom. So I realized I had in my hands a piece of the old Babylonian version of the flood story, which is a piece of gold in the world because everyone is interested in the flood story and nobody ever gets their hands on an unpublished piece which had never been seen by any other Assyriologist. So I was rather excited about it, and what happened was he took it away, picked up the lamp and said, "And what about this?" And when I'd gone through the rest of the material, trembling with excitement and thinking, can I borrow this for a while and read it, he went, and I didn't see him for the best part of a decade.
Oh no. Now he's going to tell you this was before they figured out a way to tell people to leave it on consignment here and let us people look into it and do all these things and stuff. But you can tell from his talking right there that it got him very excited to have seen a separate and unpublished piece of this.
So I knew that this thing was in circulation, and this was before the trustees of the British Museum had produced this handbook about how to lock people to the floor and take over their property for the trustees. So I just let him escape. But I knew that sooner or later it would come back to the British Museum because all important things do. Some of them, for example, are temporarily in the Louvre, but sooner or later they will come to us.
That's making a joke and a pun on words and so many things. Britons probably get more of a joke out of this than Americans are, but temporary in the Louvre is the bathroom. So while you might find something temporary in the Louvre, he touts, being from the British Museum, that they eventually, if they're decent artifacts, will show up there.
So the thing is, when I finally got this thing into my control, I had the luxury, to say, of reading it properly in privacy with a good light and so forth to get the guts of it out. And it became apparent that the thing was of 60 lines in length, and although the beginning was exactly the same as is attested in the other sporadic examples, the rest of it was very startling.
So it was slightly different than a few other versions that are there, and I've spoken to you about the Babylonian version, the Akkadian version, the Akkado-Sumerian version, which is the very first one they took in, and it changed over time slightly. But then there's the actual Sumerian original, and it's sad to say, but the Sumerian original we have is them telling you about something that had happened a long time ago. So it's kind of in contrast with this that's fixing to happen to them now. And it shows you that, just like the Bible says, it had happened 2 times. And he put a rainbow saying that it would never happen again and all these things. And then the Promised Land, which in reality ended up being Sumeria. And from that Promised Land, we've gotten so much. Let's continue, though. This is entertaining in parts, definitely.
Now, knowledge of the flood itself on cuneiform tablets has been in the public domain since 1872, when George Smith, the character on the left, for the first time was a modern human being who read a piece of this dog biscuit kind of material from this barbaric background and discovered that he was reading Holy Writ virtually in this peculiar format. And the story goes in our department record, I'm sure it's true, that he dropped the tablet on the table in his anxiety and started to run around the room, holding his head and making funny squeaking noises, and eventually attempting to remove his clothing. And this has gone down in...
And it's gone down as somewhat of a laughing matter, and people think about this as a laughing matter. He's going to clarify that in a moment. But just like the Greeks, whenever they had that eureka moment, he went outside and realized that no one knew what he knew, and it was so important, and literally almost had an epileptic seizure. And whenever something like this comes over you, it's like an embarrassed, warm feeling. The next thing you know, you'll find people tearing their clothing off, and you say, he's gone mad. But in reality, he's found a point of clarity and sanity that others don't have. Check out what he says about this.
history as a laughable matter, but it's almost certain that what actually happened was he had an epileptic fit, because the impact of discovering for the first time the text of Genesis, which everybody in 19th century London knew by heart, existed in this peculiar rival form.
Now they call it a peculiar rival form, and still to this day it's kind of referred that way, but people that research know this is the original form, and the supposed Hebrews were taken into captivity in Babylon before they were released again by Cyrus the Great, and that they would have been very familiar with this story. Very familiar with this story. But there's another component of this where whenever the Sumerians did have this flood come in, whatever was left of them were taken by the Proto-Akkadians and flipped up over their shoulder, which they are far to the north, and around and over into Anatolia, and then the Elamites took over. And this is stated clearly in a bunch of different tablets, but the worst one, and it can put these two things together, is the Lament of Ur, as they call it, or the Lament of Inanna, and she's telling you that she came whenever this is her account, whenever in the story, whenever this happens to the world, Enki, who is the very first one where he's saying, read wall, hear me now, for he was sworn to secrecy that he would not tell. And so he did not tell Atrahasis. He told a wall. He spoke to a wall. He made sure Atrahasis was on there, and then he started speaking to a wall. This is the trickster moment, if you will, on what did things. Strangely, in the story, they tell you that the Sumerian gods went up above the earth into heaven and watched this from above, and everybody get destroyed. And then Inanna comes down and begins her lament, where she tells you all the people have died off and they're clogging in the rivers and all types of stuff. And that's something that's, I guess, left out of the Bible. A little too gory. It's funny how some of the stories that they have are very straightforward, and they talk about sexual things straightforward and so on like that. But then in the Bible, that's all broken into innuendo at best, right? So I want to clarify that point as we go on. And he makes a joke about how the man's appearance looks, and of course it has to do with himself.
So George Smith, in 1872, discovered this for the first time. There was a huge furore about it, all sorts of discussion by all sorts of people. I'd just like to draw your attention to the image of Smith on your left. He has the broad, intelligent forehead, leadership kind of profile, fine beard, lucid, intelligent eyes, and so forth. There's always been this range of characteristics that the trustees have looked for in their Assyriological employees.
He keeps it light.
So the thing is that when Smith published this, he wrote very lucidly about it and its implications for the biblical story, because it contained not only the approximate parallel, but a much more specific one. For example, the fact that when the flood was abated and things were quiet, a series of 3 birds was released, and only the third one came back. I mean, didn't come back, so he knew that something had appeared above dry land, which is, of course, what Noah did in the more popular version of the story, as celebrated in Hollywood, and the really good one, which you have to read in the original in Babylonian.
So he's letting you know the really good story and the original one was from the Babylonians he refers to, but the better story is really probably the Sumo-Akkadian version of it, because it goes into a little bit more depth in a few situations. But there are those that say, because that's after the fact, is that even opponent true, or is that people trying to interject themselves, or something along that line? But it even refers to the mountains of Arata, which is Ararat in the Bible, and where he ended up landing. The strange thing about that is that if you were down in Sumeria and then got flooded out, the flooding is going to wash out into the ocean. You aren't going to go north. So this again shows some reality to this situation, right?
So one of the interesting things about the version which he discovered, that 1872 tablet. It came from the library of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC. It was one of the king's own personal copies of his standard literature, although they didn't know that securely at the time. And when Smith made his very quick and very accurate translation, it included a description of what the ark that this Utnapishtim, the equivalent of Noah in his version of the story, had built. And the description comes out as a cube, that's to say an object which is the same height, width and length in all dimensions. So,
now there's some discrepancy about that, but what we're seeing here is actually Ashurbanipal's later component of it, and in their tales they had taken the thing into a cube form itself. Now there's something to do with sacred geometry and everything else that leads into this point that's here, but he's about to show you what the original one really was in the oldest forms of the tablet that we found and connections. And yes, this is going to go to part 2, so it'll be in your top left hand corner and probably have something on it like part 2, and you just click on that. After this one it'll go to it. I'm going to try to keep it to 2 parts.
The clergymen, who were extremely worried about the way that the Bible had been undermined and what this might mean for the end of civilization, came back in force saying, well, this is rubbish, this isn't nothing like the Ark in the Bible. I mean, it's a cube. I mean, whoever had a boat that was a cube, it is mad anyway, and they have to take notice of this. And so they were impelled and felt encouraged to dismiss evidence which was unwelcome to them.
In other words, they tried to dismiss the fact that they found where the original Bible story came from, and in doing so they called, well, the shape of that's rubbish because we've got these other pictures and everything of later accounts. And they say, well, later accounts and earlier accounts, the one closer to would be more accurate. And this has gone on for quite a bit, but scholars know now there is no questioning this fact. Let's continue.
Of course, they were operating on the assumption that the real Noah's Ark, so to speak, looked like this. I was rather fortunate to find this contemporary photograph, which is what we call research in the British Museum. It's called Google generally. And here it is, exactly as it was, reconstructed in this image according to the text of the Bible.
The problem with that is that it shows you it's got pitch-covered thatch sides on a log raft base, an opening in the side, not in the ends but in the side, pitch-covered thatch roof, and then there's a 1 cubic vent just below the roof all around. So it's to let air in and cow farts out, if you will. The problem with this is with the weight around it, it would be submerged more than halfway full, almost up to the top. There's no way that this would actually be able to hold water in the configuration that it's shown. But as opposed to the one that you find in nursery rhyme pictures, this is the biblical idea of what it had looked like. And knowing how we build rafts and everything, as slinky as this thing would have been, in any type of turbulence, it would have come apart. This is also made to look like a house floating. Right? Let's continue.
So the situation was that in 1872 and a half, there were people who believed in the Sumerian version. There were people who stuck fast to the Bible, so you had a cube or a coffin, and of course at the same time everybody really knew what Noah's Ark looked like. It's one of these things. There's usually a giraffe looking out the window just to complete it. So in fact, Ark fanciers, so to speak, have these 3 alternatives at their disposal.
Now, if you look up on the roof, there are a few birds there, and we're supposed to believe that he kept all the kinds of birds there are, and that becomes a farce. Again, I could have gone to something like Aaron Ra, where he, looking at taxonomy of creatures, figures out that it would take 3 aircraft carriers to carry all the animals that are on the world at an ark known at that time, and that's only if we took prime examples. Now, modern apologists say, well, what they took, now they won't believe in evolution, but imagine this. What they've done is they said, well, he only took 1 type of large cat, a pair of those, and then whenever he got back out of the ark, that large cat turned into just boing, cheetahs, lions, pumas, everything, Lord knows who walked them over to North America and made mountain lions and so on like that, who took certain kinds of bears all the way to the Arctic, where the other bears were taken to North America by people and all this. None of this is mentioned. Oh, that's right. Just magically, like they learned how to walk all the way there, they learned how to walk all the way home. And in their starving hunger, never ate one of the other creatures. Or wait, or we believe that maybe, oops, the unicorn got eaten, or it didn't quite make the boat, or so on. Well, the unicorn is a one-horned rhinoceros, and always has been. Oh, it changes things. But we're familiar with this look of everything that goes on here, right? And you may have seen the new one that they've built wherever it is in Kentucky and stuff that's supposed to go along with it, and then they have dinosaurs in it. Yeah, the dinosaurs were actually Jesus horses. But those three birds in the story do the same thing to a T. And what's odd about that is that's a maritime thing, where they know that if there's local land anywhere, they can release a raven or so on, and it stays lower to the ground and flies off, and if it can't find a place to land, it'll try to come back. But then there's a second form of the dove, and much like a homing pigeon, whenever you release it, it flies up in circles going up above the boat, and if it sees something, it takes off for land, and so it gets much higher. And there's a homing aspect, like homing pigeons and so on. And quite frequently, whenever you take a bird like that, it's going to take off, and the first thing it's going to do is try to go home. And so a sailor that's lost will keep these with him and release them at certain points, especially if they're out far at sea, and it'll tell them, well, home's that way, if you can't figure it out astrologically. And this is known from elder times, but the history of boat building, people try to believe something like this was the first boat, or things along that line, and that's no truth whatsoever into it. They find 16,000 BC depictions on walls of boats and so on, and it looks like it may go back much before that, for that wasn't the first boat. One day they'll find a picture in a cave that's 40,000 years old in some remnant of a cave. Like they found this recent boat dock that's huge. It's like Fisherman's Wharf huge, right off the Isle of Wight over in the UK, leading out in the ocean, but it's 30 foot below the water level, 20 to 30 foot below the water level, and they're excavating it now and finding all kinds of items, and this is well into the 6,000 BC range. And if you don't think that's important, that's twice the dating back of the pyramids. Twice. But this boat ramp doesn't look like the first one that was ever built. Hell, it looks like it's a boat building shipyard, and it's huge. It's the size of Fisherman's Wharf. Hundreds of yards worth of what we call a wharf today. You have boat ramps and docks and things along that line. It's amazing. I'm waiting for more to come out on it. I found a deal that is describing it more in a different range, and showed a couple of pictures of some boards that they found and how they've been sloughed. And they're not cut like a modern 1x12 or anything, but you can tell that they've been sheared off into planks and then placed like that. And it looks like they were all held together with cinched in ropes and things like that, and wedged in together and built more like a log cabin house, if you will. Let's continue though.
So it made it even more astonishing when I had the leisure to read this tablet, when it turned out the following thing, because the god Enki, who had discovered that the world was going to be destroyed, decided it wasn't a good matter, and that he picked on some human being to build this lifeboat to rescue all life forms against the waters that would come.
In the earlier story, it was Adapa, and Adapa was going to go to heaven, and then all magic was going to leave mankind and leave them without the knowledge. And they told Adapa not to, because the Sumerian Apkallu priest, or the On and the rest of them, whenever they had him come up there, he thought that they might give them a poison or something that would be death and then take him into the afterlife, and so not to eat food. So this was a threat back then, that you would go and visit a foreign leader and he'd act all fine about it, but he would poison your food, and as you started to poison, they would kill you. And that's taken from a few other stories, but I'm not going to go there. Let's continue here. Now, Enki, by the way, En means Lord, and Ki was the name of the world, or the earth. And Tiamat and Ki got into a fight and blah 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 and everything, and this great story of dragons and so on from back a day that leads into this. Bahamut and Tiamat, now they had destroyed and run into each other, and that tale looks like it was the destruction and formation of our planet. These people would have had no idea about it, but they may have formulated it. The more we study what they formulated, what they knew, and things like that, like had advanced trigonometry and so on, and had declimated the world in a 360 degrees that we still use today, knowing that the world was round, saying statements such as, the stars are like our own sun, but as a torch in the distance, far, far away. And that accuracy of thought really didn't come until a modern time, just a couple of hundred years ago. We're talking about thousands and thousands of years ago, and the first people that seem to have a large inkling to this. But we study aspects of what people knew, and I'm about to go into Archimedes and people like that, and looking at it and why they got named their name and so on like that. Let's continue.
It's always been a mystery, actually, why he picked on this Atramhasis, whose name means extremely intelligent, because however intelligent he might have been, it is clear that Enki didn't trust his knowledge of boat building at all, because in this tablet he tells him all the information you need to know in order to build this boat. In other words, it's one of those, like one of those boxes from IKEA, which has all the information on a mimeographed panel on the side, so when you take it home, you can build it on your own. So the first piece of information that came out of reading this tablet was that the boat was round.
Now, that throws off the whole square idea, but in his, it was round. And in fact, the words begin with K, and he's one of the people that deciphered K alphabet, K, things beginning with a K, and put it into our Sumerian dictionary, if you will. So he's pretty sure that he had it right. But round, I want you to keep in mind, after the whole thing, this picture that's shown there and the way that it looks, and we're familiar, and that's very much a Spanish galleon facing to the left or to the right, if you will, but in reality it was round.
And I'm fairly secure about most words beginning with K, because I worked on the K volume, so I felt that the word Kipatu was under my belt, but I thought I'd make absolutely sure that I hadn't misremembered it, because round boats are not something you tend to encounter in your normal life, until you remember, of course, that riverine communities all over the world have used round boats, which we called coracles, and which in Arabic are called guffa, and that in ancient Mesopotamia they certainly had boats like this, and it suddenly became a rather intelligible picture that for an old Babylonian poet who lived when he wrote that tablet in about 1800 BC, so it's 1,000 years older than the Assyrian version, in writing about the story, conceived of the ark in question, the boat to save lives, as a round coracle boat, as people built on the sides of the river.
But there's a lot of discrepancies, and not just in the simple shape. Now, we're led to believe that this boat was all made out of wood, and you have it in your mind that it's all made out of wood, and that's fixing to change right now, too.
And this makes a lot of sense, because the thing about a coracle, if you've never been in one, you will have to take my word for it. I've been in one once. The reason is I'm the president of the British Coracle Association. Not a funny thing at all. I don't see why you're sniggering. This is a major tribute to me as a person. I haven't got a gold chain. It's a bit annoying, but they promised me one, and I had to go in one, so I've been in one, so I can talk about this with a great deal of familiarity. And the thing about these boats I know from many years of experience is that they don't sink.
he had to throw that in there, and that's another part of his flavor, where he'll say something that's outlandish and they'll laugh about it, and and he's, why are you laughing? This is a great um, thing that I've done, and blah blah blah. I went in a coracle once, but he knows that they don't sink, and that they're what's used during that time in the elder times that are there. But it's round, and how are you going to bend all those boards and do all those things like that? And that sounds like quite the manufacture from something that's more just built in straight planks or a canoeish type build, doesn't it? Let's continue.
And if you've got the job of collecting up all these male and females and putting them in a boat, it doesn't have to go from Portsmouth to New York. All it has to do is float. And the coracle doesn't have a front or a back, it just floats, and they float beautifully. So that is why the poet who wrote this story, trying to visualize the thing in a realistic way, decided it was going to be a giant coracle.
Now, the boats that it was designed off of in the Bible are an ideal boat that you could row in a way and aim in a way. And what's kind of special about these old triremes and these things is the way they're built. You can take and run them aground, and then get back in it and start going back out the other way. And whenever you start going back out the other way, it's like you're berthing a boat too. And yeah, you may flip it around or do things, but you don't necessarily have to. You just flip yourself in the seat and you're going the other way. This was used during the Viking times and all types of things where they can get away real quick. They've got it all set up to do it. In fact, they kind of set it up before they leave, that in case they come back and they're in a hurry, they're going to get the hell out of there. There are tales of sometimes when people got left and so on, and you know what happened to them. But let's continue with this giant circle boat now that we're looking at, a variation on your mind and what you think that the Ark may look at. Again, this is going to go to a part 2. It'll be in your top left-hand corner, but let's continue.
It was going to be a giant coracle. The surface area of the plan is given. It's 3,600 square meters, so bigger than this room. And in this IKEA list of instructions, he tells him of the materials he will need. That's to say, the rope, which is wrapped around to build the body of the boat, the ribs made of wood, and the bitumen to coat it inside and out to make it waterproof.
Now, he's just described there is that what it's made out of, and what coracles are made out of, is rope, in a coiled rope. In fact, kipartu is referred to as a bushel type thing, and this would be a round basket. And we've used a rounded bushel basket for a size and a measurement and a concept all the way through our modern time. I distinctly remember my parents talking about picking fruit and stuff by the bushel and all these type of things. So, still held true to this modern day. Let's continue.
He not only tells him he will need these materials, but he actually tells him how much of them he will need in order to complete the job. So this is where it becomes something very remarkable. So,
remarkable indeed.
Of course, Iraqi coracles look like, or used to look like. The one at the top on your left is a fairly modern one of the last ones ever made, probably. And the one below that is the runner-up for the Guinness Book of Records award for the most males ever stuffed in a single coracle with success. And in fact, they were disqualified because one of them was a boy, and they thought that was cheating. So that's them. And then in the middle is a drawn from a lantern slide, which was given to us in the museum by an old lady from her father's collection. And we had it blown up, and you can't see very clearly on this screen, but you've got 2 women who are doing the grand tour and have clearly been persuaded by some slick organizer of holiday activities to go in one of these boats and sample life in real, and they all look terrified.
And just to look back at this picture right here, you can see this man gets around well and paddles himself in long in something that looks like a broom paddle. And there also would have been longer poles in areas where there were just swamped out areas that they would have. They would go by and use poles, like you see people using with rafts and people that are in the Everglades and situations like that, or that you might see in Venice with these poles that push people around through some streets that look like they're just made of water. Well, it's a highway of a way to get from place to place, but also what it brought was it brought water all the way through into the city to a certain point. And they've had versions of this that they show in the Sumerians where it comes in under the wall. They dug this out. It comes in under the wall and gives them water, even though they've got it outside. And they don't have to go outside to grab the water, and so on. And that goes into a lot of other tales. But just point out here, you know, what do they got? 20, 30 people inside one of those little coracles. Now, sure, it's bigger than that, but you don't see it squishing to the ground. You don't see it looking like it's going to flood. If everybody got on one side, it would still be hard to flip the thing, and it appears to not be having any trouble whatsoever with its girth of weight. You can imagine if you took 4 large cows and stuck it in this thing, it probably weighs less than those people, or roughly the same, and wouldn't be having as much trouble either. Let's continue.
So the thing is that the coracle in Iraq is known in ancient times. It's on the sculptures, for example, but also from many anecdotal and photographic pieces of evidence from the 19th and 20th century as well, even though I think it's now disappeared. So the other photograph which I will now show you is this, which is from a pair of lantern slide pictures and part of a sequence of someone who photographed the construction of a coracle on the banks of the river in Iraq in about 1920.
This is he said it's from slides. It's a lantern slide from a point before we had electricity where they would take and shine light through a negative. The old slides that people used to watch and they had to put them in the right order to show up and flip them the right way and so on. This is an old slide there, and that looks about the size that they ended up having close to 30 people in. You look at it and it's hard to believe that you could just cram them all in there. Like, how many people can you fit in a VW Bug? But it shows you the carrying capacity easy of something like this. And if you wanted to say, well, I have 100 bags of grain and a couple of people and we're pushing the thing down and carrying things back and forth, it's easy to see. Again, this is from 1920s, but looking at this thing, the only thing would have been different is the ethnicity of the people that were doing this at the time, and about 5,000 years worth of time.
And here you can see, in principle, how this boat is built. And what you do is you have to have this great quantity of rope, and you have a pith. The pith which comes from the trunk of a palm tree, which is twisted and twisted and twisted until it becomes a thick rope, and it is exceptionally strong.
And the oldest of these tell about pith and how they're using it, like a pith helmet, if you will, and this construction that's much like a basket that you make out of this pith, and how tough that it is, and it is by literally taking one of these giant palm trees and the heart of the trunk itself, quartering it, and then chopping it into straighter strips, slicing it out of it, and then winding it all around and around, and eventually then able to twist and form and create rope. And this rope's usually about the size of your finger to your thumb. Some of the smaller coracles do it with smaller, and it seems like the larger the coracle, the larger the rope, but it gets to a certain point when they start only about the size of your finger to the thumb, and they put them in multi-clustering. I'll show you this coming up.
The way in which the coracle is to be made is you draw it out on the ground in a great circle, and as it comes back to the beginning, the next bit is laid on top of the previous one, and it is stitched north to south, and you go round and stitch north to south, and then the third on top of the second, and you end up with a great floppy basket. And when you've done that, you have to have ribs which fit round the frame, which is laced to the hole, and then the bitumen is applied.
So, whenever I was a kid, what was really, things were always in my face. My mom had this carpet that my dad had gotten overseas, and we had kept, and it was nothing special. It was just something that kept into the entryway if we had a tiled entryway and stuff for us kids and stuff. And so the thing could get dirty and whatever of it, but all it really was a multicolored coil of rope that went around and 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 around. And I remember thinking one time whenever I was a kid that if you just clipped that thing apart and ran it out, it'd probably be 100 yards long, and this thing's only what, 6 foot across by 5 foot, slightly ovalish looking, but that appears to be the way it formed because of the way they started it. Kind of got an egg thing going in the middle as opposed to a circle, and then this was the shape of it. But it's all floppy, and then they take braces that are running all the way down to the center and up, and they put them around as ribs radiating around the center of this thing to give it structure. Then they stitch through this material around those posts and attach them to them real good. Then they go in and they seal with bitumen on the inside, and then they come on the outside and they seal it all with bitumen.
So something very interesting happened to me, probably unique situation.
I'm sorry, I have to break right in, but you know reed boats float on their own. I mean, the ancient reed boats of the Sumerians, which pretty much predate the ones that they find around the Nile or whatever, but those were just reed boats just made in a pile of reeds. You can basically just get a bundle of 3 or 4 bundles of reeds, put them together, you put 2 together and stitch them, and then you pitch one a little bit higher on right, a little higher on the left. Do that 2 more times, stitch it all together, and this thing's a floating boat that's going to last for a long time. Even as it rots and it does things, it'll start to become waterlogged, but you can pull it up out of the water, give it a few days, and it's almost like brand new, and you can continue to use the thing over and over again. It floats. It's almost like saying styrofoam. It doesn't really go bad. So perhaps even better than a wood type concept. I mean, in this picture you can't really see it and make it out probably because it's so small, me having to have it picture in a picture, but here's a man coming up in a coral on the edge of this thing and all of their works that they use with it.
The central portion of this tablet is full of numbers and very technical, and I'm frantically innumerate. So I got a bit of help with dealing with the numbers, and I never built any boats at all in London, so I wasn't really on top of it, but I discovered in the library of the Ethnographical Institute in our museum that a man called Hornell wrote in 1920 an account of how these coracles are built, for which this is an illustration by somebody else. So this Hornell was a very worthy person, a great boat historian, and he was from Scotland, and he was a man of very small number of words. His sentences are extremely terse and very difficult to understand.
And the Scottish are well known in Irish as shipwrights, and it could be the fact that they go way, way back. I mean, in times that we know of, the Portuguese built great boats and stuff too, but they've always been well known for it, and mainly shipyards and things like that, and we could look at that situation, but let's just continue.
And the Babylonian, which is more or less preserved, is very terse and difficult to understand in different areas. So I had this unique situation, but I used Hornell's description from 1920 AD to understand the narrative written in the 18th century BC about how to build these boats, and at the same time use the Babylonian to understand what he meant in English. And eventually both things became mutually intelligible and the whole sequence emerged. So I'm not going to go through all this in laborious detail. It was tempting to do this and then perhaps suggest over wine there might be a short paper of test questions for you all to fill out. But there is one thing I want you to retain.
So he mentions again that he thought about going into it in detail and then over wine, perhaps having a test afterwards. But
from this experience, Brad, though it may be for many years to come, the measurements of the materials are, of course, given in Babylonian measurements, not in English. They weren't that advanced. So when it came to the rope,
another joke,
needed to wind round to make this boat, this god Enki explained to Atrahasis that he would need 14,430 sutu measures of rope. in order to build this